Thanks.
Our next speaker is Samantha Trumbo of Caltech, who will be talking about hydrogen peroxide within the chaos terrain on the surface of Europa.
Okay. Can you see my screen, or are you seeing presenter view?
We're seeing the presenter.
How about now?
Looks good.
Okay, so thank you for having me come give this talk today and for organizing such a great virtual conference. My name is Samantha Trumbo, and I'm currently a finishing PhD student at Caltech working with Mike Brown. And today I'll be telling you about some of our results using Keck Spec to try to understand the surface chemistry of Jupiter's moon, Europa. And in particular, I'll be telling you the story of hydrogen peroxide on its surface. Trying to advance the slides.
You may have to click on your Zoom session to bring it to the front, or on your presentation. There you go.
Okay. So before I get into any details, I'm just going to start off with a little bit of background about Europa, hydrogen peroxide, and why we should care about both. So Europa is a really interesting body to explore in the solar system. And this is because it likely hosts a global ocean of liquid water beneath its surface crust of water ice. And what's really exciting about this ocean is the fact that at its base, it's probably in contact with a rocky seafloor. And so that opens up the possibility for hydrothermal interactions and water rock cycling that can lead to a source of reductance for life, making the ocean a potentially habitable environment. The problem is that in order to be truly hospitable and habitable by our standards, that ocean would require a corresponding flux of oxidants that would also be useful to life. And so luckily, Europa's surface is a very oxidizing environment, and this is because the surface ice is continuously bombarded by particle irradiation from within Jupiter's magnetosphere. And so high energy electrons and ions break apart the surface water molecules, which can then recombine to form oxidants like hydrogen peroxide, which can be useful if they make it into the ocean. And so we know hydrogen peroxide is on the surface. It's been detected in full disk spectra via a very prominent 3.5 micron absorption band. But what we'd like to try to understand is its distribution on the surface relative to potentially active terrains, and also the factors controlling its abundance in the surface ice, because both of those things can tell us how relevant it really is to the subsurface chemistry. So if we look at laboratory experiments that produce hydrogen peroxide in the lab by bombarding water ice with particles, they tell us that on Europa it likely depends on two key factors. One being the availability of water ice on the surface, because that's the precursor to hydrogen peroxide formation, and the second being the local surface temperature, where lower temperatures are expected to produce much larger hydrogen peroxide abundances. And if we look at both of these things across the surface, we can see that they're not uniform. So what's shown here is a spectroscopic water ice proxy. This data is actually from Keck Osiris, and you can see that the iciest regions of the surface are in the mid to high latitudes of the leading hemisphere. So this is the hemisphere that faces forward in Europa's tidally locked orbit. And these same areas are also the coldest on the surface because they're very reflective and they're away from the comparatively warm equator. And so if we combine those two laboratory predictions, we would expect most of Europa's hydrogen peroxide to fall in these regions. And so in 2016, during an observing run, which used Keck Spec along with the adaptive optics system, this was actually for a different project, but we had enough time to get just a couple of test slits across the surface of Europa to look for that 3.5 micron band and see if our understanding of this really important surface species was truly complete. And so this is what we expected to see. Within a slit position, we expected to see the largest peroxide absorptions in those cold, icy terrains and smaller ones near the warm equator. But when we went and reduced our data and extracted the spectrum, mapped the strength of that feature across the surface, we got something like this, which is basically the exact opposite of everything we expected based on our understanding from the lab. We see instead larger absorptions due to peroxide at the low latitudes near the equator. And if you look at just 2 example spectra from within that slit position, you can really see how robust those differences are in terms of that band depth. And if you look very carefully at the distribution within this slit, you can see that it's also not symmetric about the equator. Instead, the largest absorptions seem to fall pretty perfectly within this black outline. And what that outline is showing you is a region of what's called chaos terrain on Europa. Chaos terrain are geologically young surface features. They're salty and they're thought to be regions of exchange between the subsurface and the surface environments. And so this is really puzzling and potentially exciting to see this association. So in 2018, we went back to Keck, again using NIRSpec and AO, to see how widespread this pattern was, and in particular to cover these other large-scale chaos terrains across the leading hemisphere. And what we saw was essentially everywhere we put the slit, this pattern was reproduced. The hydrogen peroxide always wanted to be near the warm equator, preferentially associated with chaos terrain. And when we put all of our data together from 2016 and 2018, we obtained a distribution like this. And so this is really confusing. It seems that the hydrogen peroxide is not only not following the temperature trend that we expect from the lab, but it's also not following the water ice, because it's mapping to these salty regions that are exactly the least icy regions on the leading hemisphere of Europa. But it's also really exciting because this association with these geologically resurfaced terrains suggests that potentially hydrogen peroxide is more likely to make it into the ocean than if it were constrained to the high latitudes away from such regions. As far as an understanding for this distribution that could help tell us why our laboratory predictions were wrong, we do have a hypothesis. There have been very limited lab studies that have shown that if you have CO2 in your surface ice, you can greatly enhance your hydrogen peroxide yields, potentially overcoming the temperature trends that we would expect. And so our hypothesis is that really this peroxide band is tracking CO2 on the surface. We do know that CO2 is on Europa. It has not been mapped. But there was very limited data from the Galileo mission that did suggest just tentatively an enhancement in these chaos regions. And so it's possible that this widespread map that we were able to obtain with Keck is really hinting that the CO2 as well is coming from within Europa's ocean. And that's potentially exciting because it suggests an internal carbon source, and it can tell you something about the ocean chemistry. So right now, this is just a hypothesis. JWST should be able to answer these questions for certain, because they will be able to see the CO2 absorption on the surface. But I do think this is a great example of sort of the richness of information that we can obtain about Europa and other solar system bodies from Keck that can really inform the future exploration of these worlds. And so with that, I would take questions and say thank you.
Thank you very much, Samantha. That's actually a fascinating result. I'm curious, are there other species that you can probe in addition to hydrogen peroxide to see if their mappings also are unusual?
Yeah, there are. So this last summer, we actually obtained some coverage of the trailing hemisphere over here. There's an absorption that was seen in full disk spectra using NIRSpec, also in the L band, that is currently unidentified, but it's potentially related to the salt chemistry of Europa's surface, and it can inform whether Europa's native salts coming up from the internal ocean are sulfate dominated or chloride dominated, and that can tell you something about the geochemistry of the ocean and how it's evolved over time. And so that's something we're looking into.
Thank you. We have another question that just came in from James Wallace. Have you considered doing the same measurement with Enceladus?
It would be great if we could do the same measurement with Enceladus. Unfortunately, Enceladus is just so small and faint. We can't resolve it the same way we can Europa, and even getting a high signal to noise spectrum in the L band, even with a telescope like Keck, would be difficult, requiring a lot of integration time. It's possible that an absorption related to hydrogen peroxide was seen by the Cassini mission, which visited the Saturn system and took 3 to 4 micron spectra of Enceladus, but it's a little bit ambiguous. And so this is something that is an open question, and hopefully James Webb will be able to obtain a good L-band spectrum of Enceladus and answer that for us.
Great, thank you. I think with that, it's 10 o'clock and we will wrap up session 5.